ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the DGAP morning briefing on geopolitical challenges. I'm Henning Hoff, Executive Editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues. Tomorrow we'll reach the one-year mark of the conflict that is Europe's worst security crisis since 1945. It has destroyed the post-Cold War order in Europe and is likely to further reshape regional as well as global politics. It has revitalized the so-called West and for now strengthens the transatlantic relationship. The United States, to quote Richard Holbrooke, has once again acted as a full-blown European power. However, the war has also shown that countries in the so-called global South see things differently. First and foremost, however, Vladimir Putin's war of choice, his breaking of the UN Charter, has caused huge suffering and destruction in Ukraine. Russia's attacks on civilian targets and the atrocities committed are as numerous as they are revolting. The Russian armed forces, as well as its Wagner mercenaries, have suffered huge losses, 200,000 dead or wounded, according to some Western estimates. Ukraine's losses are possibly about half as much, with a much better dead-to-wounded ratio. It's clear to whom human life matters and to whom it doesn't. The Ukrainian people have reacted with an unwavering will to push Russia back. Their resilience, as well as their military successes against a seemingly all-powerful aggressor, have been remarkable. The United States, the European Union, and individual countries in Europe, especially Poland and the Baltics, and beyond, have provided help for Ukraine and have sanctioned Russia. Since last summer, Ukraine is a candidate to join the EU and would like to join much more quickly than presently seems possible. To take stock 1 year on and look ahead, I have the pleasure of welcoming three excellent speakers. In order of appearance, it's a great honor to welcome Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, Chairwoman of Ukraine's Parliamentary Committee on EU Integration and a former Vice Prime Minister for Ukraine's European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Ivanna will speak about the domestic situation in Ukraine and the country's perspective for EU membership. A very good morning to Kyiv, to the Rada. Ivanna, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Next, we will be hearing from our DGAP colleague, Dr. András Rácz, Senior Research Fellow, Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia, here at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and a mainstay of our briefing since the very start. András will once again share his analysis of the military situation. Good morning, András.
Good morning. Thank you.
And I should mention at that point that András unfortunately has to leave us a little early, so get your questions to András in as soon as you can. And last but not least, we have with us Dr. Stefan Meister, head of the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. Stefan will speak about the present state of Putin's Russia 1 year after the start of the war, and also pick up on the prospect of negotiations. Good morning, Stefan.
Good morning.
Each speaker has 6 to 7 minutes for their introductory remarks. We will be opening up for your questions and comments after roughly 30 minutes. For the Q&A, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and put your question in person to the panel. You can also be welcome to submit questions and comments via the chat functions. Please note that this event will be recorded and that we will have to close on time at 9:30 a.m. At this point, I'd like to thank my colleague Mila Nitsch, the DGAP Central and Eastern European expert who has been instrumental from the start in organizing these events, and to Jan Stockmann from the DGAP's Executive Office, who's supporting this event series going forward. And now, without further ado, let's turn to Ivanna for her opening remarks.
Once again, good morning, and thank you for having me here, and thank you for reaching out to different audiences with explanations what is going on the ground in Ukraine and what we are standing up to with this challenge of this brutal war that Russia has been carrying out against Ukraine and the free world. Obviously, I'd like to focus a little bit on the things that correspond to our light at the or ray of light at the end of the tunnel, our European and Euro-Atlantic aspirations of Ukraine, and want to start with gratitude to all the nations and all the politicians and experts and journalists who have contributed to making sure that Ukraine has received in June of last year this historic chance of being granted a candidate status for the EU membership. I think this is the chance that we cannot lose, and that we have to ensure that we are using to the maximum in this particular moment, when at the same time we are fighting this barbaric and absolutely bloody war for our sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence. I want to say that the status, we understand that it was both given to us on merit-based approach, but as well, it was a serious advancement for us because of the resolve, because of the courage and resilience and resistance that Ukrainian society and Ukrainian forces of defense have shown in the first months of the hot phase of this war, and after this 24th of February. And we understand that on this way, we have to do our serious homework. And we know that there are volumes, or hundreds of volumes of European legislation that have to be not only passed in the Parliament of Ukraine, but have to be implemented also by institutions being prepared, by experts and civil servants being ready to carry out their responsibilities in order to be compatible with all the European nations. And my take is that at this particular moment, this is a bit different from our carrying out the association agreement between Ukraine and the EU, because the association agreement, its major part was focusing exclusively on different economic aspects of integration. But I think that at this moment, we have to pay additional attention to the political spectrum of the Copenhagen criteria, so to the freedoms, to the rule of law. And I think that that is something that at this particular moment needs particular attention while we are fighting the war, because definitely the war is, the war is foreseeing additional compression of some of the procedures, maybe giving up on some of the things in order to get quick decisions that are important for survival, that are important for our capability to run the country in this particular time. But at the same time, I think it's important to ensure that while we are fighting for the values we believe in, which happen to be Western values, so we're fighting for ourselves, but we're also fighting for the West. And I hope we all understand that this is a common task for all of us to get a victory in this war. At the same time, it's important to ensure that the society gets what it exactly is fighting for, that the society gets its freedoms protected, that we are not falling into centralization of powers that might be tempting during the martial law, but definitely are not something that would be welcomed on our way to the European Union. I also think that it's important at this particular moment to have a realistic expectations. We are focusing here between the government and the parliament on implementation of the 7 conditions that have been accompanying the candidate status to Ukraine. And we've done some progress on each and every one of them, but we are still not there in order to ensure that we have a fully positive assessment. So we hope that the remaining time till the assessment, full and comprehensive assessment in the fall, we will be able to carry everything out that is needed, and will be able to conduct our homework for 110%, as I was told by some of our partners, because we also understand that skepticism in some societies or among some political elites is still there with regard to the kind of fast track of getting to opening the accession negotiations between Ukraine and the EU. But I believe that this is ambitious, however, realistic goal to have the accession negotiations open at the end of the year. In the meantime, I also would like to underline that I have my concerns with regard to some of the statements from Ukrainian executives that are saying that we will be full-fledged EU member in 2 years' time. I do think that realistic expectations are important, and it's important that we are all on the same wavelength and in understanding what is the scope of work that we will have to deliver upon, because otherwise that can lead to a serious disappointment on both sides. And that can lead also to serious disappointment internally in Ukraine, with the message of not saying that, oh, we didn't do everything that was expected of us, but leading towards the message, well, nobody is expecting us, which I think is finally not true. And finally, we are hearing from our partners in the West that we are part of the family, which we were aspiring to. You know, we believe that we are nobody else but Europeans, and therefore we will be able to walk the walk and towards the aspirations that we have. On the top of this, I also would like to mention that I believe that all of us will have to work very, very seriously on ensuring that after the end of this war, Ukraine is also granted NATO membership. And I think that this is critical for sustainable security on the European continent, but also for sustainable security in the whole globe. And I hope that this discussion is also taking place across European nations, and we can count on the support, because I think it will be beneficial for both Ukraine and NATO as alliance to have Ukraine in, for a number of reasons, but maybe that's a conversation for, or that's a topic for another conversation. So 1 year since the war has started, well, no, that's the wrong thing. Since I would call it second hot phase of this war, because the first one was back in 2014 when Russian Federation has got in Ukrainian soil, on Ukrainian territory with its regular troops. So 1 year after the second hot phase has started in February of 2022, we are standing. We are still free, as President Biden has put it. My only concern there is the word still, because from my perspective, we were not doomed to fall under the feet of Kremlin and the blitzkrieg, because of the capacity of the Ukrainian forces of defense, and because of the resilience and resolve of the Ukrainian society was not possible, but few have believed in that development as it was happening. So we are still resolute to push the aggressor out of the country, and we are hoping that we will have the backing of the free world with instruments, with financial support, with additional sanctions over the Russian Federation, in order to ensure that Russia is defeated, is isolated, is weakened, and is punished, in order to get the sustainable peace in Europe.
Thank you very much for a spirited sort of summing up where we are standing, and very interesting what you say about NATO membership. Probably a little more controversial than EU membership, but we'll see what our audience feels later on. Thank you very much for your remarks.
Thank you.
Now let's turn to András, please.
Good morning again. Thank you for joining us today morning. And once again, please accept my apologies for having to leave a bit earlier. So as usual, in order to give kind of an overview of the military situation, let's use again the maps provided by the Institute for the Study of War. So now I'm trying to share my screen. What are the news on the front line? Russia's claimed main offensive, or the expected large Russian offensive, has somewhat started a few weeks ago. However, such offensives usually do not start like a car race starts. So there is one flag and then the fighting starts. Fighting has actually become a lot more intensive in this section of the front line. However, interestingly enough, the Russians do not seem to prioritize one or two directions. Instead, they are pushing or trying to push the Ukrainian defenses back, at least in 4-5 places. So one place is Piansk, thereafter the Svatovo-Kremina line, then they are still trying to take Bakhmut. I will speak about Bakhmut a bit later, and they are also pushing Avdiivka and also at Vuhledar. So it looks like that the Russian armed forces do not really have one or two clearly set priorities, but are trying to achieve everything at the same time. Not surprisingly, taking into account Russia's heavy losses and the highly resilient defense from the Ukrainian armed forces, Russians haven't made much progress with this offensive in the recent weeks. They gained some marginal gains, a few kilometers here, a few hundred meters there, but there is no visible Russian breakthrough, or there is no such section of the front line where Russia would clearly have the upper hand. So the initial worries that probably that Ukrainian defenses in the Kharkiv region could be not so strong as they are in the Donbass did not come true. Ukrainian forces are putting up a very resilient defense also in this northern section. Russian troops are suffering heavy losses, mostly due to very bad tactical and operational leadership, and due to the shortage of tanks and armored personnel carriers. Russians seem to rely increasingly on infantry tactics, classic human wave assaults, often without any kind of artillery or armored support. There is a visible shortage on the Russian side in terms of artillery shells. Right now, the daily rate of fire of the Russian artillery seems to be down at around 20,000 artillery shots per day. Just to compare this 20,000 and the highest numbers in June, July, Russian artillery was able to fire 60, sometimes 80,000 shells per day. So the shortage of artillery shells is clearly limiting Russia's potentials to achieve any result on the front. I promised to say a few more words about Bakhmut. So now please allow me to switch to the map, if it's possible, if it works, to the map provided by the live EU map website, because this map offers a higher resolution. This is the situation around Bakhmut. Of course, all these maps have the usual limitation of open sources, but still, in terms of the strategic operational situation, these maps are good enough. So this is the situation around Bakhmut. During the recent weeks, Russian forces managed to cut the northern supply line leading to Bakhmut, the road M03, and they managed not to cut, but take under fire control the southern supply route, the road H32. However, defenders of Bakhmut still have supply channels open, composed of smaller roads, countryside roads, dirt roads, leading to Chasiv Yar and further to the west. So Bakhmut is still not encircled. Bakhmut is still holding, and Russian forces, particularly Wagner Group fighters, have suffered extremely heavy losses, both in the eastern parts of Bakhmut and also north of Bakhmut, so here in the Soledar-Krasnahora region. good news.
To intervene, so we can't see the Bakhmut map. There must be some.
Okay. Now you're supposed to see the map. Okay, let me try again. Sharing the Bakhmut map. Thank you for notifying. Now this should be okay. Now you see the Bakhmut map.
Yes, thank you.
Good. So here's the northern supply route cut, the southern supply route under Russian fire control, but still there are smaller supply routes connecting Bakhmut with the west. So Bakhmut is not yet fully encircled. Bakhmut is still holding. And good news from the operational and also strategic perspective, it looks like that the debate inside Ukraine has already started, whether it's necessary to hold Bakhmut until the very end. And the good news is that there is apparently the necessary flexibility on the Ukrainian side. It has already been indicated several times that if the danger of the encirclement of Bakhmut would become real, Ukraine is ready to withdraw its forces from Bakhmut. So in order not to sacrifice human lives unnecessarily. Here, there is a good analogy from the summer fightings. Ukraine, when the defense of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, somewhere northeast, a bit northeast from here, when Severodonetsk and Lysychansk have become undefensible, Ukrainian forces withdrew from those two cities as well in a very disciplined way. So here, even if the Russians manage to finally encircle and cut off Bakhmut, this would not result in the collapse of Ukraine's defensive lines. This would not result in a major strategic scale disaster. Instead, it's more likely that if it becomes necessary, Ukrainian forces will withdraw from the city in an organized, proper way. One last thing, I mentioned the heavy losses of the Wagner Group. In the recent days, very interesting things are happening around the Wagner Group. Now I stopped sharing, so or at least trying to stop sharing, so you can see me as well. But the Wagner Group seems to be now in a really serious structural crisis regarding its role and place in the Russian military machinery. The Wagner Group is apparently losing the support of the Russian Ministry of Defense. This has been a trend that started already some weeks ago. Loss of trust is due to the heavy losses the Wagner Group is suffering. Henning already mentioned that tens of thousands of Wagner operatives were either killed or seriously wounded while trying to take Soledar. So there is heavy losses on the Wagner side. There is not much battlefield achievements. And regarding Prigozhin himself, his main patron, General Sergei Surovikin, has been demoted. So since General Valery Gerasimov, chief of Russia's general staff, took over the main command of the Russian forces in Ukraine, Surovikin's importance, Surovikin's influence has decreased. So the Wagner Group has lost, or the main patron of the Wagner Group inside the Russian defense apparatus, Surovikin, has become weaker. And Wagner has long been dependent on the Russian regular military in terms of supplies, ammunition, intelligence, operational planning, medevac, a lot of things. And this dependence created inherent limitations on how much Prigozhin could confront with the leadership of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Developments in the last days indicate that Prigozhin overestimated his own power and its influence, and now he's getting reprimanded. So that's it for the start. Thank you again for joining us today morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, András. Maybe one quick question. Do you expect a Ukrainian counteroffensive, or sort of what kind of time window would you look at?
Regarding Ukraine's possible counteroffensive, yes, I definitely expect it, both due to political and military reasons. However, a successful large-scale counteroffensive cannot really start first before the arrival of modern Western tanks and armored personnel carriers in larger numbers, and there is also a climate factor. So the spring Bezdorozhye or Rasputitsa period, so when the ground is still muddy, when there is still a lot of rains, this Bezdorozhye period, this period of when the roads are impassable, this period has to come to an end. And even though this winter was strange, so we can't really forecast when exactly the Rasputitsa will end, these two factors combined make it for me most likely that the Ukrainian counteroffensive can start in late spring, the earliest. Late spring, early summer, somewhere there, but still a lot depends on how the Russian offensive progress or doesn't progress.
Thank you very much, András. And now let's turn to Stefan, please.
Thank you very much. I just want to zoom a little bit also into Russia and look where Russia stands, and also just a couple of words about Putin's speech this week, I think, which is also very telling. So I think we have to admit that 1 year after the Russian invasion in Ukraine has started, it is unclear when and how this war will end. Despite impressive Ukrainian resistance, a huge Western military and economic support for Ukraine, and the most comprehensive sanctions we have ever seen towards such a big state like Russia, Russia is currently neither winning nor losing the war, is my impression. All signs are on a protracted war, and Putin thinks time is playing for him. I would even argue, if you're looking into the regime stability in Russia, the regime is rather consolidated. There are no actors who challenge Putin. No one is safe anymore in the system. The whole discussion about oligarchs and so on, I think they lead in the wrong direction. A majority of the Russian society support Putin and his policy. Many people believe or want to believe the Kremlin's propaganda not to get problems, also with an increasing repressive regime inside of Russia. We observe a lock-in effect in Russia, which means through the Western sanctions from outside and the increasing repression and lack of any alternative opinion than the official propaganda inside of Russia, the regime is able to consolidate the society around the war. The degradation of Russian politics, society, and elite, that's, I think, a kind of irony. So the degradation will make it even easier to control the country. Nobody in the system on the top level is allowed to leave the country. That means even the liberal part of the elite is serving the regime to survive and keep it functioning. As we have seen it with Putin's State of the Union speech on Tuesday, the Russian president is preparing the society for a long war. The decoupling of the regime and its propaganda from the reality is further going on. It consolidates the Russian discourse on an anti-West and anti-US narrative, which is picked up also from Soviet times and is just reanimated, and it exists in the Russian society. Now it's not anymore, first of all, the fight against the so-called Nazis in Ukraine, what Putin also mentioned in his speech, but it is Russia is fighting a war against the West and the regime in Kyiv as proxies of the West. So I think he argues that we need a bigger war because we're fighting now a bigger war. Yeah. So, and I think that might help also further to consolidate the society behind this narrative. The whole speech of Putin was aiming not towards the international community, but was a clear message towards the Russian society that there is no alternative than winning the war against Ukraine. And I think these are not good prospects also for negotiations, discussion we have increasingly started in the last weeks. Putin believes that the Russian society is more resilient than the Western societies. So the Western societies are here the weak spot. It's not Ukraine, but it's our wish for peace in a way. He believes the longer the war takes, the more European and US societies want peace and are not willing to take additional costs. He thinks time is playing for him in this sense. And economists argue that Russia has enough budget for 2 or 3 years war. It is still able to produce weapons and munition, even if it has also shortages, but it still has much more to attack Ukraine. It has much more to fight here in this offensive, and it still gets also semiconductors, technology to produce weapons through schemes via Central Asia and Turkey. The goal is to mobilize more than 1 million people, and Russia has more people to send into the war than Ukraine has. We are now in the Russian offensive. András has already mentioned this, which was announced since months. This offensive is much less impressive than we expected. Russia has neither the equipment nor the troops to gain much territory, is my impression. Both sides are losing currently a lot of troops. So it's not only Russia who is losing a lot of troops, but also Ukraine is losing a lot of professional troops also. And as also András mentioned, in late spring, a Ukraine counteroffensive might be expected, whose quality and success will be linked to the number of new trained soldiers and the amount and quality of Western supplies, weapons. So I think this is really crucial for Ukraine. I just want to make this point again. In early summer, this offensive, or somewhere in summer, then it might stop. And I think we will have rather a deadlock with what we supply at the moment. The West is currently supplying enough weapons that Ukraine is not losing the war, but not sufficient that it can win the war. All the speeches at the Munich Security Conference should have a reassurance effect for our societies, so Western societies and elites, that we are on the right track in supporting Ukraine. But there is a gap between rhetoric and reality. The support in our societies for the war is declining. There's a growing interest in negotiations and peace, and this is exactly what Mr. Putin wants. And after a possibly deadlock in summer, we will see a shift to a low-intensity war. There might be a window for negotiations, but since both sides have a maximalist approach, no breakthrough is expected. So I'm very skeptical about any negotiations, about any Chinese proposal also for negotiations with what I have seen in Moscow yesterday. The dilemma is that as long as Putin is able to attack and destroy Ukraine, he will do it. Every break will be used by the Russian side to prepare a new attack. And just on my final point, I think the announcement of the withdrawal from the New START agreement, also in Putin's speech, is not a sign for an imminent attack with a nuclear weapon, but it's rather a part of the information campaign and should signal to Russian society and the West that Russia has nuclear weapons and can use them. I expect more nuclear messaging. I think that's the last thing which is left over for Putin to escalate. Yeah, in a way, there's no energy weapon anymore, and there's not enough troops and weapons to really to do a big offensive. So I think the nuclear messaging is key from the Russian side, and we will see more tests, more training, and more modernization of Russian nuclear forces. And I think also these activities aim on our societies to push for peace in the light of a possible nuclear catastrophe. And just to sum up, I think we need an honest discussion about our goals also in this war. I think we try to prevent this, and we need to discuss. We need also to discuss with our societies that this is a longer war and how important it is to support Ukraine. The less we do now, the old formula, the less we do now, the more expensive it will be in longer term. So I stop here at this point.
Thank you very much, Stefan. High time to get our audience involved. So please raise your hand if you want to put your question directly to the panel. And while you're thinking, maybe one quick question to Ivanna. Since Stefan mentioned the Chinese plan, do you have any hope, or sort of what is your take on this initiative? I read this morning that the government in Kyiv says it has not been consulted in any way by the Chinese. Do you see anything coming out of it possibly?
No, I'm pretty skeptical with regard to any suggestions. Here, I would agree with Stefan. There is no room for negotiations at this particular moment, and I do not think that any of the plans that could be put on the table with regard to negotiations could be fulfilled, because there is absolutely no readiness to come back to international law or to any reasonable respect of the rules and promises by the Russian Federation. So we see it every single day. So therefore, I do not expect anything coming out from any plan that could be put on the table at this particular moment.
And one other quick question. Stefan mentioned what he says is a sort of a widening gap between rhetoric and reality coming out of the Munich Security Conference. This is something which you worry about as well, that there's a disconnect between this kind of strong statements in support of Ukraine and the willingness of Western governments to really engage to the extent to which they say they are committed to.
Where I do agree with Stefan is that unfortunately there, at this particular moment, Ukraine is getting as much weaponry in order not to lose this war. But we are not having all the instruments that we would need in order to effectively plan our counter-offensives, for example. And from my perspective, we are in some kind of competition at this particular moment with the Russian Federation, who gets first all the necessary instruments in order to be able to start first in terms of getting, in our case, territories back or getting additional territories from the Russian offensive. So therefore, I'm worried that, for example, we had this vicious circle of discussions with regard to tanks that was ongoing for ages, for months and months and months. Finally, it has been broken, but tanks are not there for obvious reasons, for the reasons of maintenance, for the reasons of necessary training, and so on. So when from the political decision to the actual delivery and the number and quantity of that delivery that would be sufficient for efficiency of its use, we having again big gaps, and I think that's pretty worrisome thing because political pledges are not enough, and I think. Who was it? Was it Borrell who said at the Munich Security Conference that it's good that Ukraine gets so much applause, but it would be much better that Ukraine gets much more munitions and instruments to protect both civilians and to push the aggressor out of the country. At this stage, we are not there, even though it's not to say that we are not appreciative of tectonic changes that have been happening in policies, in politics, and in support of Ukraine. But I think we are still not there mentally in the West, that we are all ready for defeat of Russia. I see the fear of the defeat of Russian Federation in many statements, and I think that is the difference between us Ukrainians and the Western societies and Western politicians, that we have crossed the line of fear because of what we experienced over this period of time, while this is not the case in the West.
Thank you very much. Now let's turn to our first comment or question from the audience. I have a raised hand by Talha Güney. Please introduce yourself and
Thank you. Talha Güney, my name. I work for FGS Global in Brussels. I have a question for Ivanna, if I may call you Ivanna. It's on the internal governance structures in Ukraine, because I think that winning this war is a challenge, and I think this is a challenge that Ukraine will succeed in, and I hope so. But I think the bigger challenge will be establishing effective governance structures in Ukraine in the long term, to be truly part of the European family. And my question is that while externally we have President Zelensky and as a strong symbol of Ukrainian resolve, internally there are several loci of power, like the Klitschko brothers and Zelensky and other local actors. How do you think will this fare in the long term? I mean, will there be like a unified government or unified governance also in reality, or will there be still these strong local actors which could also impede establishing effective institutions in the long term? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let's also hear from Tom O'Donnell.
Yeah, this is to Stefan. And I was wondering what you think. just to expand somewhat on your point of that support among some sections of society is diminishing. It seemed to me that the whole thing with the Schultz delay, he knew he'd have to eventually agree on the Leopards, but this purposeful delay, by delaying, he seems to have established himself as the leader de facto of some sort of a pro-stalemate, pro-negotiation section of German and EU sort of elites and population. Even in the CDU, it seemed to me it undermined Merz in a way, because the some more conservative sections who, want to see negotiations and don't, will look now to Schultz as, oh, well, maybe he carries this banner for him. So it's not just in his own party or in the Linke or the AfD that this was seen quite positively. So I was just wondering what you might think about that. I think that with that delay, something I noticed in social media and various contacts, especially in the business community, they were quite emboldened by what he did during that period to speak out that, hey, what's wrong with the stalemate? What's wrong with the quagmire? They'll be forced to negotiate, etc.
Thanks very much, Tom. Could you also sort of state your affiliation?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm a global fellow at the Kennan Center, the Wilson Center in Washington. I also teach at FU right now.
Thanks
I'm
so
in
much.
Berlin. Yeah.
Thanks so much. And there was one question from the chat, the fighter plane debate. Maybe there's something for András, but let's maybe first go to Ivanna to answer the question on the power centers and sort of the political landscape in Ukraine.
Well, first and foremost, I think institutional building is essential and critical for our success of European and Euro-Atlantic aspirations in Ukraine. And I think that checks and balances have to be preserved. And I do not see it as a challenge having, different strong groups inside Ukraine being also Western oriented, but rather as a positive sign of different political actors that could lead towards the success of the country. That's from my perspective. And I think that Ukraine will only benefit if we will have the variety of, let's say, tactical suggestions. How do we reach to that particular goal? For example, I see my political party as well, the European Solidarity, as one of strong and serious actors in that respect as well. So we have to understand that I think that President Zelensky is greatly representing Ukrainian people and Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian resolve, and he does it very, very well, but he is not definitely the only person who is fighting this war. And it is because of the Ukrainian society, and it is because of the backing of different actors, because we are all united around one goal. We want to survive. We want to have the future. We want to ensure that the country is free and independent. And we have our possibilities for, I don't know, disagreements in the future in a very democratic way. I think that this is exactly what we want to achieve, to have the right to disagree inside, to have the right to go back to some normal political discourse, which I think is okay. And with regard to institutions, I think institutions will only benefit if we will have different stakeholders contributing to their building.
Thanks so much. Stefan, perhaps?
Yes, I will also pick up one or two questions from the chat, if you may allow, on Germany and the Leopards and this question. I think there is a kind of a feeling in the German elite, in parts of the German elites and society, that it's impossible to win a war against Russia. And I think also this understanding on one point, also we have to talk with the Russians, and if you think in longer term, on one point we have to integrate also a different Russia into Europe. I think Scholz being very cautious, really thinking long and then making some decisions, I think reflects also a mood in the society, I think, and in his own party. I think Germans don't want that the government is moving forward, that we are taking lead, that we are the first who providing weapons and tanks. I think that's very much reflected in society. People are really afraid of a bigger escalation, and I think he might be here closer to a majority of the society than the foreign minister. In a way, and I think his way of reassurance with the Americans, so it was also a kind of a bargaining, this Leopard deal, to bring in also the US with their tanks. That also reflects that Germany is linked to the US security guarantees. We are not sovereign in our own security. So and and he wants to have this reassurance also with the US. I think that's very crucial for him. But I think that's an approach which is very much criticized from outside and maybe also from many of the German media. But if I'm discussing with people in the society, I don't have the impression that this is seen so critical. So it's even too much what we are doing. I think this is sometimes also the impression I have. Yes. I just want to respond on this question on China and weapon supply towards Russia. I think we know that they get technical equipment, semiconductors also from China and from other Asian countries, that there are schemes also of supply. I'm very skeptical about really serious weapon supply from the Chinese side. I think the Chinese want to have a weakened Russia, but not a Russia which will lose a war. I think, and in this way, they might support the Russians if this is taking place on one point. But to really more engage in this war, to be really kind of a party, which is then also proved, I think I'm rather skeptical here about this. But I think these warnings by the US, we should also not underestimate. So then there was a question about unrest, possible unrest in Moldova, Georgia, and Serbia. I think it's also a very important question. I think especially Moldova is at the moment a goal of Russia to raise internal unrest in a very difficult economic situation where the country is, with a very vulnerable government. We just had the government reshuffle also in Moldova, I think, which was an important step also to strengthen before the local election this government. But I think there are several entry points for unrest in the country. There might come up more demonstrations also raised by pro-Russian actors, funded also by Russia. The Russian disinformation is also working quite well. So I think it's very vulnerable, and it needs also more economic support and more support also from the EU. I don't see this at the moment with Georgia. The government has shifted more or less to a Russian or Russia-friendly approach. We see a foreign agent law in Georgia, so I think they're already preparing for being on the safe side, and I see it neither also in Serbia at this point. And I just want to add a final point on Wagner and Prigozhin, I think, which has been a very, for me, first of all, a social media bubble in a way. So this whole discussion around Wagner, I think, because Prigozhin has its own media, he was able to raise so much attention. But as we know, the Russian system, if you're getting too much attention, the system will punish you. And I think Prigozhin was never really a powerful actor in the whole system. And on one point, Putin just decided to bring Gerasimov back, and now they're just trying out Wagner, just not to make it too powerful in the public discourse, but not in politics.
Many thanks, Stefan. I know András has to leave us any second now. Maybe just sort of one quick question about the fighter planes. Would that sort of make sense in your view, or would it make a difference, or what is the important part about that question?
It will absolutely make sense. However, it takes plenty of time. I mean, when it comes to the fighter planes, one needs to differentiate. I mean, Ukraine already received some Air Force assets from neighboring countries, from Eastern European countries, both fighter planes and helicopters, but those were ex-Soviet models mostly. So the real question is providing Ukraine with Western-made fighter planes. But the logistics there is extremely complicated in terms of training, infrastructure, equipments, and really everything. It's a completely different level of technology. So in the long run, Ukraine will anyways need to be rearmed to Western-made weapons, full and complete. But this, and fighter planes will indeed be part of this rearmament process. But in the short run, I do not really see the possibility of providing Ukraine with a significant number of Western-made fighter planes. It's just way too complicated. So even if the political will emerge, it's not yet there. But even if the political will emerges, from then on, the logistical problems to tackle are going to be much larger than the one with the tanks. So I do not see Western fighter planes appearing in larger numbers anytime soon. And again, please accept my apologies. I really need to leave now. Thank you once again for joining us today morning. Goodbye.
Many thanks, András. Let's turn to the next question by Klaus Wittmann, please. Introduce yourself and put your question. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Klaus Wittmann, former general. I teach contemporary history at Potsdam University. Last semester, it was recent history of Ukraine. I have to make a point to Stefan Meister, although I think we do not disagree there. But I strongly warn against language like both sides have a maximalist approach. On the Russian side, it is destruction, denial of the right to exist as a nation, a annihilation of Ukrainian identity. On the Ukrainian side, the maximalist approach is just we want to live free and in peace within our borders. I know you agree, but I think that particularly in the public discourse in Germany, where people like Wagenknecht or General Fahd or some figures in the Protestant church make this equalization, as it were, it is extremely important to stress a clear difference. And on the Chancellor, I just want to repeat what I said 2 days ago in the Kamin Runde there at the DGAP. I think upholding all his principles, not to become a war party, not to make German Alleingänge and so on, he could also have made the decisions about the tank coalition half a year ago. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Stefan, do you want to respond? But I think there's not a more of a semantic.
Yeah, I don't disagree. It's maybe not. What I just want to say is, I think also I completely agree with the Ukraine needs to free its territory. It's about the sovereignty of the state and its borders. But and it's also important to have a kind of a very strong approach. But I'm just have my doubts, for instance, how soon Ukraine is able to take back Crimea, for instance. Yeah, I think you need a completely different equipment. I think you need things Ukraine will not get at this point. And I think there will be also some kind of expectation management, what is possible under the circumstances and the current circumstances. And this is also what I was saying before. I think this gap between rhetoric and then reality also limits the abilities of Ukraine to do the things Ukraine has to do or wants to do. Yeah. So, and I don't argue here for how to say it, that we Ukraine should make compromises. I think that's a very dangerous discussion, but we should need to be also, or it should need to be also realistic what is possible, yeah, at this point with the kind of support it gets. Yeah, because I think this will create frustration in the Ukrainian society also, and we will also in a way create frustration in Ukrainian society.
Many thanks. Ivanna, do you also want to come in? Yeah.
Yes, if possible, I wanted to raise my hand. Well, I am very grateful to Klaus for this distinction. I think it's incredibly important because the reasons for fighting, the logic is totally different from the Russian Federation that is fighting the aggressive, unprovoked war, and Ukraine that is basically protecting not exclusively itself, but actually is protecting something that on which the whole world order after the World War II has been based. And here, you know, if we are starting to discuss anything with regard to any compromises, I think we're also finding ourselves in the potential agreement that it's okay to redraw the borders in the 21st century by force, and that is an invitation and indulgement for many other autocratic regimes that would be interested in having something similar in other parts of the world. And I think that this is very dangerous. And with regard to what Stefan was saying, you know, that we have to be realistic with what is possible with what we are receiving, I think it's the other way around. I think it's we have to push for additional instruments, for example, not only for fighter jets, but for example, longer range weaponry that would allow us to reach out to possibilities of destroying military targets on the territory of Ukrainian Crimea. And I underline, everybody, I think nobody disagrees that Crimea is Ukraine. The only thing is that I am all the time, you know, kind of puzzled how Crimea is different from all the other territories of Ukraine that have been announced Russian by the Russian Federation after the sham referendums in 2022. Why the sham referendums are any different from the so-called referendum back in 2014 on the territory of Crimea. So I think that here we have to be sincere and honest with ourselves, and that is about the honesty inside of the Western societies and among Western politicians that is not there till the you know till the end, so to say, of this of the seriousness of being ready to help Ukraine in really restoring its territorial integrity and ensuring that this restoration actually leads to a sustainable peace in, or as I said, on the continent and in the globe, on the globe.
Many thanks. We have a few more minutes, so there's still time for another question, but I would have one also for Ivanna, picking up on something Markus Meckel, the first democratically elected democratically elected foreign minister of the GDR, East Germany. He sort of suggested you mentioned that the sort of feeling part of the European family is something which sort of helps Ukraine and sort of supports the sort of aspirations. He said, if I read it correctly, steps in between could be done. For instance, giving Ukrainian parliamentarians observer status in the European Parliament. Is this something you'd welcome, or sort of, or are there other intermediate steps which could be taken to go along a probably long accession process?
As far as I know, like in the European Parliament, for example, the Renew group is actually already seriously considering kind of getting consensus around this suggestion of having some kind of observer status for Ukrainian parliamentarians with the European Parliament kind of to being prepared, so to say, for the future membership, and also maybe getting some answers and some training for the issues that would have to be dealt with on the Ukrainian soil. So I think such approach or any other creative ideas which seemed to be impossible a year ago are absolutely welcome, and that you know, the range of those ideas could be pretty wide.
Thank you very much. There's one question by Carsten Vogt, and then we conclude.
Carsten Vogt, I'm the former coordinator for German-American cooperation in the Foreign Office. My impression in the last months have been that some commentators might know Russian public opinion and American public opinion quite well, but they don't know about the formulation and the development of German public opinion. There was a big difference always about the reporting in the press and about what is really going on. And I saw this especially insofar as commentators were commenting on the SPD. For example, from my knowledge, there was never an opposition from the Young Socialists, but the tradition to commentate, they have to be against such a military engagement, brought many commentators, including some who are active in the German Association of Foreign Policy, to comment that there was opposition from the left in the SPD. It never has been there. And there was a wrong analysis about the situation. And this is not the only mistake which was made, but that's due to a different discussion, and we have to analyze it in a different way. But one element is very important in this, what is going on in German public opinion. When we started the Afghanistan war, the resistance to take part in the war was in Germany much, much stronger than in the US. And the US made a lot of commitments. In the end, it was much easier to maintain the consensus in Germany than in the US. And I predict the same insofar as Ukraine is concerned. It will be easier in Germany, with all complications which we have in public opinion, to maintain a consensus, to help the Ukrainians and to win the war than in other countries. And when you listen to Macron, he makes big statements, but you see the results, they are more limited. Different countries have different cultures to deal with these issues. And Germany has a culture to be relatively cautious, but it doesn't mean that they don't live up to the commitments. Second short remark is insofar as NATO membership is concerned. We never should forget that the situation now is very different from the situation at that time. At that time, when the first decisions were taken in Bucharest, the majority of Ukrainians were against the NATO membership. And to commit yourself to a membership in NATO while the population is not supporting you in such an exposed situation poses you with very different problems. Now you have a population which is in favor of NATO membership, which makes it easier to be in favor of NATO membership. The problem which is there, the exposure is naturally more risky than it was at that time. And therefore, I think also when we discuss this issue of NATO membership, and I'm very open-minded in that regard, I think we should also consider the different situations which compared with the situation in Bucharest and which we have now. We are living in a different world also insofar as this question is concerned. Thank you.
Many thanks. We run out of time, but maybe Stefan, and then finally Ivanna. One final remark, sort of where sort of if you want to pick up anything Carsten Vogt just said, or think ahead again. I mean, you already did that, but will we, in a year's time, will we have a similar conversation or a different one when we meet again?
I want to pick up one question also from the chat about how to break this rally around the flag in Russia. And if it's possible, I think I still think at the moment it's not possible. I think this is about a defeat. If there is a defeat, if Russia has to leave Ukraine, I think that will be the starting point also for changing the regime, or at least the leadership in Russia. So I think this is something we have to understand, that as long as we are on this level of not losing the war with a strong rhetoric, I think, and it's playing in time. I think it plays more in the hands of Mr. Putin and the stability of the regime. And if we're not closing this gap, I think it will stay like it is, and it will be a longer war. And I agree with Carsten Vogt that there might be small, more limited promises from the German side, but they do fulfill then also these promises. So and keep also the line. But again, if I'm traveling around in Germany, I think there's a very different mood. And I think that's really very critical about an ongoing war. I really see a decline also of the support in society. And this is not enough picked up by the government at the moment. That's at least my impression. So there's really this gap with Berlin, yeah, and the society. I've seen this in many presentations and discussions I had, and I am really concerned about it. That's why I'm making this point here so strong, and maybe make my argumentation also a little bit vulnerable. But I think this is how many people are seeing it, and I think it's really important to keep the line and do this support now. And I'm really afraid of in 1 year. We are still discussing the war, because the war it's going on maybe on a lower level, but we are not doing sufficiently to push forward and to help Ukraine also to gain more territory.
Thank you very much. And Ivanna, final words.
Yes, thank you. Just to support the understanding what is ongoing with the support of EU and NATO membership in Ukraine for the first time, I think, in our history after renewal of independence in 1991, the support is 86%, equally even for both EU and NATO membership, and that's totally right. That it's the vast majority of the population, almost all of the population is for it, and but that, I think, yes, we are in a different position, but I think it will still be a more sufficient and much cheaper to have Ukraine inside the NATO, inside the alliance, than to have it outside. Because if we will not get to the point when that Ukraine is in after the, again, I underline, after the end of the war, after some agreement will be signed, because any war, I think, or majority of the wars that are finishing with the agreement, we will have, if Russia is not weakened to the point that it cannot attack again and is not punished, then we will have Russian Federation again acting in trying to reassemble itself and attack again. So we want to ensure that that is not happening, and that definitely is not happening if it sees the language of strength and power and unity on the and force on the other side. That's the only language they understand. And with regard to the declining support in the Western societies, I think it's also something that requires additional leadership from politicians at this particular moment, that requires explanation why failure to ensure Ukraine's victory in this war will actually damage the well-being, security, usual way of life in any European state and in any free world state. And I think that this is the explanation that has to be the work kind of that has to be taken to the public across different European societies, because it's definitely, it will not stop with Ukraine falling. It means it will have the dire consequences, not to mention that such countries as Georgia or Moldova will immediately cease to exist, but definitely it will have much more serious consequences even for NATO if we do not succeed. If we succeed, if we win, then NATO will be stronger, and then Ukraine in NATO also will be stronger together. Thank you.
Thank you. I think stronger together is a concept which I'm personally very much for. And rest assured that as the German Council on Foreign Relations, we'll try our best to continue this discussion and bring facts and analysis to the German public in particular. Please join me in joining our panelists this morning, András, Stefan and Ivanna. Thank you for joining us this morning, and I'm wishing you a very good day.